Yes, I realize that the concept of Earth orbiting Saturn only thousands of years ago, and I'm talking like 6 to 12, maybe 15,000 years ago, sounds absolutely insane. I get that, all right? I was right there with you 10, 12, 13 years ago when I myself ran into this theory. And I, probably much like you, shut off the video and walked away because the premise is insane. But I wanted to ask the question now, because I wish somebody would have done this back in the day to help me along, is why does the concept of Earth orbiting Saturn sound absolutely crazy? There's technically nothing unscientific about a planetary body orbiting another planetary body, right? We have the Earth and the Moon right here. We know that Saturn and Jupiter and other planets also have moons, or I should say more specifically, we have planets in orbit around other planets. So when someone says that the Earth is rotating around, or orbiting, I should say, when Earth is orbiting around Saturn, that premise is not scientifically inaccurate. And it goes for mainstream too, which makes it worse. That concept is not even mainstreamly inaccurate. So why did I, much like you probably are about to, write it off? This is a question that we need to ask. And if we are going to participate in the scientific method and employ our critical thinking abilities, we are required to ask this question. Otherwise, we are being dishonest. Now, which one of you agrees that dishonesty in your historical studies or your scientific studies is acceptable? Right? It's not acceptable. There is no point in time to where a dishonest approach will ever be acceptable. And hopefully every single one of you said, no, of course I don't want a dishonest approach to this stuff. Right? So in our historical studies, we find intellectually dishonest approaches all over the place. Even worse, this stuff gets embedded into our mainstream timeline. Then, if we factor in the theory of uniformity, and we combine that with the mainstream historical timeline, suddenly, any other possibility or any other possible answer to our questions regarding history gets thrown right out the window. So right now, the concept of Earth orbiting Saturn, we've established that is not scientifically impossible. So, if somebody presents a scientifically plausible theory towards answering unknown questions, in this case, it's going to be for both, cosmology and history, we as researchers need to take that seriously. Right? One of my favorite quotes is from Aristotle, and he said, "It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it." And I love that one because that is something that is absolutely lost on our mainstream scientists and historians. And I mean, really, even the farther, deeper alternative history people, right? This concept of listening to one side or the other is dead to these people. Everybody has built up these psychological walls over the course of their life against new ideas, which are, ironically, scientifically possible. Now, this is not how research is done. So, when we make this premise about Earth orbiting Saturn, and intrinsically it's scientifically possible even with mainstream mechanics, you cannot just toss this aside. Because the reality is, the reason why you're probably into science or history is because there is so much stuff that we just do not know, right? We're trying to figure out what's going on, and if we are not entertaining new ideas backed up by evidence, how the hell are you ever going to advance, right? You're just never going to make it, right? What makes this even worse is one of the main reasons why you will not entertain a brand new idea is because you are currently suffering from unbelievable levels of psychological conditioning that you have ingested over your life without realizing it, that have built up these artificial walls that keep you from seeing the potential truth. Now, the Saturnian cosmology is not only just interesting in a scientific and basic historical way. Saturnian cosmology actually appears to maybe have the answers to a lot of questions that humanity has about themselves. So that's why I feel it's extremely important to at least hear this out. Take it into consideration. And please go over the evidence, right? I mean, if you find something that's wrong, and I mean scientifically wrong, not mainstream garbage wrong, no, real proof. Like, you have evidence, you have predictions, you have testable experiments to do. And this is the kind of stuff we need to see, right? And while you're testing these things, you might find even more information that will help this theory or other theories along, right? Testing is not just for proving something correct. We can also prove things wrong. Now, all right, enough schizo stuff for that. But one more thing I do want to say before we go into this is please understand, not only is the Saturnian cosmology just a basic scientific possibility, but the reality is right now there are experiments being done in laboratories which are proving that this might have actually happened. There is real science going into this. It's not like dark energy or dark matter or space-time where everything is invisible and you are not allowed to be shown any evidence for it, right? This stuff is actually being proved. It's being proved, oddly enough, by NASA themselves, right? I mean, the James Webb Telescope is absolutely destroying mainstream and starting to prove the possibility of Saturnian cosmology correct. All right, that's enough. Let's get into what the hell I'm talking about so you can get an idea of what Saturnian cosmology is and what our ancestors are talking about when we start to study ancient history. Let's lead off with a recap from the last show. So the last show, what we did is we just stated the basic premise that thousands of years ago, and a side note, here's one of the problems that I have not seen solid evidence for yet, is how long ago technically the breakup of the Saturnian configuration happened. So the way the main story looks right now is that Earth orbited Saturn somewhere between like maybe 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, anywhere up to like maybe 10, 12, 15,000 years ago. Now, I realize that is one hell of a gap, and that, and it's a serious problem. And I have yet to see anybody really come forward yet and conclusively prove when we physically broke away from Saturn. But regardless, that's actually, that's not that long ago, especially if you're still in the mainstream mindset, right? I mean, that means that the current solar system that we're in is not that old, which immediately invalidates pretty much all of mainstream cosmology when it comes to our solar system and how it evolved, right? I mean, so one of the funny things about current mainstream theories is like the solar nebulae hypothesis, right? The accretion disk situation that has 0 successful predictions to its name. 0 successful predictions. Right? This is how mainstream operates. They make these garbage theories and they claim it as fact, and then of course now you think it takes millions of years to create planets, or billions of years or whatever, so the concept of a Saturnian configuration goes right out the window. So we now know for a fact that that's not right. So it is entirely possible scientifically that just thousands of years ago we were hanging out with Saturn. But how long ago was this? I don't know. I have not seen that age yet. So while we're using our imagination and going back in time, I know it's a big gap, but imagine 6,000 to like 12, 15,000 years ago, we are currently orbiting Saturn. Now, Saturn does not look like the Saturn that you know today. This is extremely important. The Saturn that we know today is essentially a turned off brown dwarf star. Back when we were orbiting Saturn, Saturn would have been considered, or not considered, it was a full-blown brown dwarf star. Now, there's nothing weird about a body orbiting a brown dwarf necessarily. Mainstream cosmology has absolutely found this to be true, right? There's nothing weird about an object rotating around a brown dwarf. But what is possibly weird, at least from a mainstream perspective, is that Earth was not orbiting around Saturn in brown dwarf phase. we were orbiting within the brown dwarf itself. And we would have been within what is called a plasma sphere or a plasma field. Now, this is what radiates around a brown dwarf. This is essentially an opaque plasma shell. And and it's electrically charged. We'll get into the electricity part of all that in a little bit. Maybe not this show. But while we're in this plasma sphere, this is where Earth is having its golden age. Now, within the plasma sphere of a brown dwarf, what right now we think happens is that if you're a planetary body inside this plasma sphere field, whatever, what's going on is the brown dwarf is radiating its energy, its heat, but the heat basically gets trapped within that plasma field. So a body within this plasma field is just chilling, hanging out, and it's being radiated by heat all around the planet simultaneously. This is why in the quote-unquote golden age, we don't have a winter or a fall. There is no weird temperatures going on the various latitudes of the planet. Nothing like that is happening. None of our ancestors describe the golden age in any sense of the term with any kind of seasons or anything like that. In fact, it's the exact opposite, right? They say, hey, look, everything was great. Everything was bountiful. No matter where you went, you didn't have to wear clothes, and you were just always getting a suntan. A nice, gentle suntan, because everything was temperate and fine. Like, there was no problems. It's nothing like today. And of course, this is going to cause a problem for the mainstream mindset person when we postulate that there could be a planet with an entirely even surface temperature. Right? Because right now, if you look at the way the solar system operates, we don't see any planet really like that, right? You're either boiling hot, or you have weird seasons like Earth and Mars, etc. There's no planet that's all happy, joy out there, right? They're not all partying and laughing at us while we have seasons. We don't see that. There's none of that stuff. But this is part of the theory. And we now have our ancestors telling us that this is what they experienced. So if we have a scientific basis for a technical golden age planet, and then we have our ancestors talking about it, that's a pretty good start. Now this will beg the question, and you're right to ask it, how the hell are we in a brown dwarf and we're living and this is happening? What the hell? Are you crazy? It's a star, right? It's a thermonuclear thing happening. How are we surviving this? It's very important to understand that in Saturnian cosmology, and by extension, plasma physics and plasma cosmology, a star is not a thermonuclear thing, right? That is not what's going on. What's going on in the universe right now, and this goes for everything right now, so you can apply it to whatever the hell you want in cosmology, is that stars are powered by what are called Birkeland currents. Now, Christian Birkeland discovered this stuff like 100 plus years ago or something like that. Dude was brilliant. And for all of you mainstreamies who have not heard of Christian Birkeland, that means you're in a lot of trouble. Because Christian Birkeland did legitimate, real science that is still actually employed today. Right? This guy was not a joke. So much to the point that he was up for multiple Nobel Prizes. Go look it up if you don't believe me. This dude was hardcore real science, right? And what he was messing around with was electricity and plasma. Yeah, just like Tesla, doing that kind of stuff as well. So this dude's principles are not made up. These things are not fiction. They are proven today. They are known today, but they are ignored by mainstream cosmology. So if you love cosmology and you have never heard of a Birkeland current or Christian Birkeland and all of his plasma stuff, you are literally behind real science, right? You're not operating in the realm of reality. You are operating in the realm of theory. Now, you can operate in the realm of theory, and that's fine, but you cannot look at other theories and laugh at them when you yourself are in a schizo world of your own. All right. So anyway, Christian Birkeland, real dude, figured out stuff with plasma physics. Now, a brown dwarf star is not a thermonuclear explosion constantly happening. It is powered by Birkeland currents that stream throughout the universe. This is where all stars come from. Now, depending on, the voltage and the characteristics of the Birkeland current will depend on what kind of star you're getting. And of course, the surroundings and the electrical interactions of the surroundings will also give you what kind of star you're dealing with. So now a brown dwarf is simply being powered by a Birkeland current. This matters because it gets rid of that thermonuclear garbage, and now we can start to postulate different kinds of environments that planets could exist in. Why? Because of electromagnetics, right? Electric fields are extraordinarily important, right? Electric current. This stuff is what mainstream cosmology is completely missing. Now, I'm not going to go too crazy right now in this show because there's a lot to talk about with respect to brown dwarfs and Birkeland currents and how they're created and all of that stuff. But here is the basic. You have the Birkeland current fueling the brown dwarf. The brown dwarf creates basically a plasma sheath around itself, and then anything within inside that plasma sheath will be uniformly radiated, which means that we have a nice, gentle temperature. Now, if you're thinking, well, what the hell, we're being radiated, how are we surviving? I mean, that's still got to be pretty strong, right? Yeah, of course. The reality is, don't forget that Earth also has its own magnetic field, which is regulating that current within its environment. So this is why we can say that the possibility of a planet existing within a brown dwarf is 100% possible. All right, so if this is happening, what the hell are humans seeing, right? So this is where we start looking at history and what we could kind of consider eyewitness testimony, because the eyewitness testimony goes right along with the science. All of our ancestors talk about a time when there was essentially this, creator ball of light at the North Pole, and it did not move. It was stationary. So what we see when we start to look at something like that is that we see basically proto-Saturn. We'll call it proto-Saturn. That's what it's called in Saturn cosmology. So we'll start using that term. Proto-Saturn, which is the brown dwarf version of Saturn, was basically chilling at the North Pole. This means that the Earth would have been locked into a polar orbit or a south polar orbit relative to proto-Saturn. Right, so if we're going to match up all of our ancient stories about the quote-unquote creator who chilled at the north, the unmoving creator at the north, the light at the north. This is the common theme throughout history. To make that happen, that means we have to be sitting at the South Pole. And sure enough, we would have been locked at some point in time at a South Pole orbit. Now, this polar orbit is precisely what we would expect when we deal with the physics of Birkeland currents, because what happens is that the planets are essentially strung along the Birkeland current line. You can essentially think of a Birkeland current as basically just an invisible electric wire that just flows through the universe, right? And they go in a coaxial twist. You can't always see them because, of course, plasma has 3 different modes, right? We have dark mode, glow mode, and arc mode. Anyway, so this Birkeland current is kind of like, it's a twisted pair or whatever, coaxial, invisible wire flowing through space. Yes, that's a horrible description of it. Please, for the love of God, go look these things up, because I'm not going to get too deep into this because it's, it makes me go crazy, and then it pisses me off, and then it makes me want to choke people. Okay, so we have basically, and it's not always invisible, by the way. So anyways, you have this, imagine like a strand of DNA, like that kind of coaxial twisty thing going on. And what happens is that magnetically or electrically charged bodies will show up and gravitate towards this coaxial Birkeland current. So you basically get planetary bodies or stars or whatever. Everybody kind of appears in a line. So the Birkeland current in this case is basically running north to south, right? It's running through Saturn, and then it's running, north Saturn all the way down through the south pole of Saturn, and then whatever the hell is underneath that or above it, whatever's at the north pole of Saturn, which we would not have any clue about because we could not see that part, right? So there's lots of unknowns too, by the way. This gets crazy. And I know it's already sounding crazy, and I'm probably doing a crap job telling you about it. But anyway, so you have the Birkeland current running through the North Pole, creating and generating proto-Saturn. That current continues down, and then any solid bodies that are charged in the way gravitate towards the Birkeland current as well. And so basically you have a string of pearls of, bodies, of cosmological bodies, right? So Earth would have been hanging out in this string of pearls. Now, Earth would have not been the only planet in this string, right? So far it seems that we also at the very least had a view of Mars. Mars would have been between us and Proto-Saturn. There could have been other bodies as well. One of the things that we find when we start getting into this Saturnian cosmology, when we go back to the ancient times of creation, we find all kinds of names back there, right? And remember, the rule on this channel is when you see the word God, you switch the word God with planet. And they have a lot of different planetary names back then during this creation time, and then during, the chaotic time when the Saturnian configuration breaks up. And that's actually one of the questions that we're trying to figure out is which planetary bodies did our ancestors see up in the sky, between Proto-Saturn and Earth. So we've pretty much figured out that at the very least, Mars is probably one of the main ones between us and Proto-Saturn in this configuration. But like I said, there's all kinds of other gods that are discussed. They do all kinds of crazy stuff as well when all hell breaks loose. So the question is, which planets that they used to talk about turned into any of the planets that we see today that currently orbit the sun? And it gets even crazier because the reality is we have all of our ancestors talking about planets being destroyed, right? Gods dying, gods being broken up, etc., etc. So the question is also there, like, which planet maybe was there but no longer exists because it was destroyed during the Saturnian system breakup. Right? So there's all these weird things. So for those of you who are trying to figure out things like Planet X or whatever the hell Nibiru or whatever might have been, or Tiamat, all of this stuff suddenly changes and gets put into a more realistic scientific context when you realize that essentially our solar system went through a car wreck and our ancestors watched it. Now that might be one of the most important parts of this entire situation, is that not only are we making the claim from a scientific perspective that the possibility of Earth orbiting Saturn was real, and, given also the variables being that it was a proto-Saturnian situation and it was we were in a Birkeland current and all that crap. But also our ancestors describe what we would expect to find had this happened. Now, this begs the question, if our ancestors were essentially cave monkeys walking around, why the hell would they describe a proto-Saturnian system in the way that they do if it never happened, right? How could they have possibly known to make up a story like this if all of our history is fake, right? The way we currently look at our ancestors' ancient histories is we take them, well, A, for granted, but B, they're generally looked at as just works of fiction. But it's funny, these works of fiction, when you start to look at things for example, when you change the word God with planet, suddenly the science starts to show up. And it begs the question, if people back in the day were dumb and couldn't possibly understand plasma physics and electromagnetics and all this crap, how the hell are they describing exactly what would have been seen had an event like this taken place? This is a serious problem that the mainstream historians are going to have zero answer for, because they're not even looking for the real scientific explanations, right? I mean, they're stuck in their own little theoretical world of garbage. But when we look at this situation objectively, we find that all of those ancient mythologies and all of those ancient religions are maybe not mythologies and religions at all. They certainly start to sound like just eyewitness testimonies of what happened to essentially launch what we know as the solar system today. Right? Now, don't forget, all through history, for whatever reason, we have all these weird creation myths, and I call them creation. And when I say creation, by the way, I'm not necessarily talking about humans being created. Creation in the sense that I am talking about is being spoken of from a human eyewitness perspective more often than not. So what I mean by that is when our ancient ancestors talk about certain creations, and don't forget, lots and lots of ancient cultures have multiple creations, right? Because the reasons why they have multiple creations is because there are multiple failures. For whatever reason, that first creation didn't work, and then, the gods wiped it clean, and then the second creation started, and the gods wiped it clean, right? The average number of creations is between 4 and 6, depending on which ancient history you're looking at. But they're there, right? The fact that there's multiple creations across the board is already weird in and of itself, but the fact that all of them describe the scientific observations that you would see given a proto-Saturnian system breakup, this lends credence that what our ancestors are talking about within ancient mythologies is not fiction. It's very possible that these mythologies are not mythologies at all. They are just describing what happened, right? What they saw in the sky. Now, when you start to plug all of this stuff in, suddenly things start to make a little sense, but I get it, things also start to get weird. Now, I've only gone over the very basics of the science of this, right? There's a lot to talk about with Birkeland currents. There's tons of stuff to talk about with respect to how our ancestors saw the events unfold, and we're going to have to be doing a ton of comparative mythology. At least the good news is that everybody essentially tells the same story. And that's another problem. Why does mainstream historians, why do they always ignore comparative mythology? The answers are essentially staring at us right in the face. We literally have a human collective of witnesses that describe what happened in our past. So when we look at ancient histories, and for some weird reason, everybody talks about how the creator was Saturn, scientific methodology and critical thinking demands that we ask the basic question, why? Now, what I've covered so far here is a possibility of why all of our ancient ancestors talk about Saturn being the main creator god, ruling over a golden age which is now gone. So we find ourselves in a dilemma now, don't we? So what I've presented so far is just the basic rudimentary scientific evidence of what could have possibly created a lot of what our ancestors appear to have recorded in our histories. So instead of taking these histories as fiction, and if we take them as reality, and then we inject the actual scientific method in it, utilizing all these new plasma physics discoveries, suddenly everything starts to change, doesn't it? Now, the implications for this are far-reaching, by the way. One of the reasons, there's a lot of reasons why people are not going to initially even bother to try to listen to the Saturnian cosmology. But one of the main problems that you maybe not even thought of, I don't know, but one of the problems that eventually shows up, and you see it basically ignored in a lot of the plasma physics culture and stuff like that in the Saturnian cosmology, is the question now becomes, where did humans come from then? Because evolution can still, I guess you could, if you want to hold on to evolution, you still can. But at the end of the day, the problem is that if you basically have a human paradise, and you have humans with a story of not only the creation, quote unquote, of the different kinds of worlds that we ended up going through, or the different cycles, but if humans also talk about human creation back then, not from a point of a religious god, but from a point of something else, bringing humans around, things start to get weird. All right. I know, I'm rambling. That's for a whole other discussion. Anyway, I don't know, it's too much. Okay, let's wrap this shit up. All right, so here's the deal. The Saturnian cosmology is not impossible. I implore you, and actually I demand it, you will pay attention to this, because if you consider yourself a student of real science and you are not looking into this, you are no longer operating in the realm of science, and you just operate on faith that the mainstream consensus is correct, and that means you are objectively insane. Now, I I get it. We've all been stuck in that stuff. I'm not above it either, but I implore you to at least try to get out of those psychological states, because it is holding you back, and it is holding back your historical studies. I absolutely promise. It is doing nothing for you. So I'm going to continue to talk about this garbage because there is so much more that we have to cover. And okay, all right, you know what? In fact, the next show, let's do this. The next show, this show just went over telling you kind of the basics of what scientifically would have been happening relative to the basics of what our ancestors describe. All right, so there's the extraordinarily shallow basic foundation. But the question of, is it possible that Earth could have orbited a proto-Saturnian brown dwarf and harbored life, human life within relative human memory? Is that scientifically possible? And the answer is yes, it is. I know that it is hard to hear some of this for a lot of you. I completely understand that. But if you are going to stay intellectually honest, you have got to admit that there is nothing in this postulate which is not possible. Now, given that it is possible, that means it's at least worth exploring, because, and why would we even explore this, right? Well, here's the problem. One of the main reasons why we study history is because we are trying to find answers for what, human past. And I don't just mean general past. I mean, like, what the hell is a human? Where did humans come from? What is our true history? Because if you look around on Earth right now, I mean, it's just weird. Like, if you really objectively look at life on Earth and the current configuration of Earth and our solar system, things do not line up the way that they should. Like, it's just off. The Saturnian configuration and the breakup of said configuration has the potential to answer a lot of other questions. And I know it also brings up other crazier questions and way deeper questions, which the reality is, if you're religious, it's kind of troubling, because suddenly the God that everybody revered and that you might currently revere in your texts suddenly is not, an old dude with a beard and a robe in the sky. Suddenly, God is now it's Saturn. Suddenly now God is proto-Saturn, and that's not at all what the Bible seems to say, for example, the Bible. But on the other hand, yes, it does say that, because when you go back in the translations and you start to trace everything back, proto-Saturnian worship is there. Okay, that's also another show. Anyway, all right, that's enough schizo for one show. Just go research what I'm talking about. You don't have to take my word for it. Just go look. We'll keep going with it, and I'll keep asking questions. But damn, dude, the answers are out there. I'm not making this stuff up. Did I not just take 12,000 pills and started thinking like, oh yeah, well, man, I think we orbited Saturn. No, our ancestors said it. And it's time we pay attention.